I'm pigged on Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into the Mavericks 111-105 victory over the Detroit Pistons. Luka Doncic with his fourth 50-plus point effort of the season. He very much had to carry the Mavericks to the finish line this one. It was a game that they wouldn't have been in without him by any stretch of the imagination. I definitely would probably denote this game quite the literal definition of the Mavericks need to get Luka Doncic help, because I have been kind of putting off labeling the title of a podcast that for some time. You know, I felt like it obviously was just a little bit unfair to some of the, the cast of players on the Mavericks team and what have you. And, I just wanted to give them their due diligence there. I mean, even if Luka doesn't have the best supporting cast, these are NBA players and these are capable guys. But I feel like today, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. What was your summation of this game from the perspective of how much of a load Luka had to carry in this game, Jaren?
Yeah, I mean, we knew pretty much at the start of the season that it would be a huge load on Luka, but I think, and we've seen it multiple times this season, but I think that this game definitely entails, what all Luka has to do for the Mavericks to even have a shot at winning. I know if some guys hadn't stepped up in the fourth quarter, the scoreboard would probably look different, but either way, Luka, 53 of our 111 points, like that's crazy. No guy should have to do that, but unfortunately, in Dallas, we have to rely on one dude to pretty much score half the team's points to even have, a 50-50 shot at winning the game. Fortunately, we ended on the good side of that 50-50, but yeah, this was definitely one where you feel for that guy. And he definitely needs help. Now, will that help come? I mean, who knows? But this is one where you look at the box sheet and you're like, wow, like this team is bad without him. And I mean, we saw that against the Jazz, and I don't know. This is another case of what we've seen all season long.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, obviously, to preface, Maxi Kleber's still out with that hamstring tear. Christian Wood still in this little brief absence with his thumb injury. But the Mavericks, to say the very least, I mean, they have at least performed mildly better in games. Obviously they performed, tenfold better than this effort tonight versus the 13-39 Pistons in games with those individuals out, Wood and Maxey. Tonight was really just like one of those inexcusable performances rather. And I feel like they've had too many of these up until this point to where I just would want to write it off as a sort of one-off scenario or something like that. We see this sort of 50-50 dynamic with the Mavericks where they're on, for whatever reason, some nights, if they shoot the lights out, they're capable of beating anybody in the NBA. And then a lot of the time they tend to kind of bog down and play down to their opponent. And that was the case tonight. And, a large part of it is roster personnel and, not having the proper depth to, honestly, I don't even know how stylistic it is. Like, you can really debate fit all you want, but at the end of the day, like the Mavericks just don't have talent to surround with Luka. And I mean, they're obviously this game to an extent was obviously a very blatant, mishap and underperformance for the Mavericks. But at the end of the day, to an extent, it does come at a good time with the trade deadline on February 9th looming around the corner and the Mavericks management potentially being hard pressed to do something. So we'll get into that a little bit. We do have our trade deadline podcast primer on the horizon. We will be going through a lot of trades and things of that nature, probably here in the next couple of days. We're going to go ahead and get that out to you as the trade deadline looms around the corner. But before we go ahead and get into this game and how the Mavericks, really outside of Luka, besides that first 6-minute stretch of the fourth quarter in the non-Luka minutes by the Mavericks bench, how they looked just completely flat tonight, and Luka was left helpless to an extent. Before we get into that and the dynamics of this game, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren. So getting into this one here with Luka Doncic's 53-point performance versus the Detroit Pistons, his fourth 50-plus point performance of the season. First thing I wanted to get into before we start hashing out all the negatives in terms of the Mavericks contributing role players and things of that nature. There were some positives. I will preface that much. It was not just all grim on that side of things, but I wanted you to sort of dissect Luka's game, because in a game where he scores 53 in regulation, tied for the, he ties his own record for the highest scoring single game performance in Mavericks history with no overtimes. I feel like it's only fair that we give credit where it's due, and we fully dissect this masterclass from him, just from how uber efficient he was. 17 of 24 in shooting, 14 of 18 from the free throw line, 5 of 11 from the field. Out of all his 50-plus point performances thus far, this definitely seemed as if it was the most efficient and sort of easy one, if that makes sense. It just seemed like it came with almost no hard labor on his part, even though obviously it did. Just in terms of the way he carried himself, his mannerisms throughout the game. He's just, coming right off of an ankle injury, him saying post-game that his ankle wasn't even 100% quite yet. It was very much wildly impressive. So what did you have to make of it? And, he starts that first quarter off with 24 points in that first quarter. He's cooking with grease right off the bat. He kind of carries it out throughout the game. Did you foresee him having a big night tonight? And what sort of and just sort of speak to the way in which he was able to score tonight from all three levels?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest. I didn't think the guy would play. I know he was listed as questionable on Sunday night, I believe. But I'm going to be honest. I really didn't think that he would play. I thought his first game would be, I think it's like Thursday versus the Pelicans. But nonetheless, we did get to see Luka, and he was listed as playing. And yeah, I mean, he just started out the gates, as you mentioned, 24 of the 30 Mavericks points in the first quarter. At one point, he had like 15 of 17 of the first quarter points, like just incredible feats that this guy was hitting, all in 12 minutes of play. And just the fashion that he was able to get to the hoop, it was masterclass in the sense that it looked easy, but it's not. Like it's crazy how efficient he was, because he was hitting some tough shots. As you mentioned, 17 of 24 from the field, like a crazy efficient night. I think this was probably his most efficient 50-point or 60-point, however you want to look at it, performance probably in his career. And he went an incredible 5 of 11 from 3-point line. Like, he didn't hack up bad shots. We usually see whenever he's putting up these 11 3-pointers per game, like he's usually throwing up, stupid shots or just a casual step back. But we didn't see that. We saw like Smart taking, he got the mismatch and he would take it either to the hoop or he would just line him up and then hit a step back 3. That's kind of like what we saw out of Luka. And there's not really, you look on the Detroit side of things, there's not really a guy that can straight up defend Luka. I mean, I know that they had Sadiq Bey on him for, I believe, the whole entire first quarter, but clearly 24 of 30 points, that's not going to cut it to work. And I mean, heck, they even had an assistant coach out there guarding him at some point. So they were going back and forth and chirping. But yeah, I mean, there's really not a guy on the Detroit Pistons roster that can even compete with Luka, and this is just another case of it. At times we would see Ivy and Sadiq Bey sort of double team him, but at one point I want to say Luka laughed at it whenever he saw Jaden Ivey coming over to double. I mean, that's just sort of what we saw out of Luka. It was honestly just a casual 53-point performance, one where he really didn't have to do a whole lot, one where getting inside was just easy. And again, I mean, he finished some tough shots, but super efficient. Whether it was getting inside or the 3-point line, it was crazy. He even had some turnaround jumpers at the mid-range. I mean, there's really nothing that this guy could do, or really nothing that this guy can't do, and nothing that the defense could do to even stop him.
Yeah, I mean, on the Detroit side of things, I don't think that, you alluded to them not having a guy that can compete with Luka on that end. I mean, obviously, I don't think there's a defender in the NBA that's going to be able to compete with Luka and just shut him down by any means. But obviously, there are guys that we've seen give him trouble and limit him at times. But certainly, Detroit doesn't even have a guy comparable to that, that's going to be able to do that to any sort of extent, barring it's Sadiq Bey maybe through stretches, but even him, he obviously failed pretty extraordinarily tonight in that endeavor. So, I mean, just in terms of the way that Luka manipulated the game on offense tonight, this was definitely out of all his highly coveted performances, games where he scored over 50 or, just signature games, things of that nature. I thought that this was definitely the most mentally savvy one from the perspective of how he was operating on offense. He was reading the side from which the double teams were coming from, and when he was getting trapped, and he would literally just drive to the rim the other way accordingly. I remember that possession where he did that and got easy layups. He was just diagnosing driving and passing lanes to an absolute T, taking exactly what the defense gave him, whether they went over or under on a screen. This wasn't a game. We've seen Luka sometimes at points be kind of indecisive when he gets to the painted area, especially if there is a really good rim protector on the other team. Jalen Duran, he's a guy who's, definitely trying to develop into that mold, but needless to say, he still has some defensive, some of the sort of the mental atonements of defense and things of that nature. He's still trying to get down. He's still a rookie. He hasn't quite got all the intangibles there yet. And I thought Luka did a really good job of just taking what the defense gave him, not being indecisive when he got into that painted area. Yeah, he was going up. He was using the post to his advantage. Once he started really attacking and drawing that defense in, Detroit would go under on screens. He was pulling that step back three, but it wasn't some sort of overt abuse. He wasn't trying to just keep chucking because he was hot. If he did get trapped, he was using the drag dribble and the pass to the outlet guy in the 4-on-3 scenarios accordingly. Admittedly, Detroit didn't double team him a whole lot in this game, but when they did, he was making the right read. And I mean, it just looked like so savvy and easy. Yet I think the average fan watching this just would not understand the intricacies and the scenarios that he's playing out in his head as he's reading the game offensively in a game like this. You have to be able to foresee every little thing that's going to happen, just in terms of diagnosing if a driving lane is going to be open, or if, he's going to pull a step back, or, there's some scenarios where he, off of offensive rebound situations, he cut directly to the rim. He even had a few give and goes. Like, you really saw the full diversification of his game outside of maybe on offense, at least outside of him, like setting off ball screens and, being used in that manner, which, just due to the play style of the Mavericks isn't really something that's applicable. So in terms of the diet of how he was scoring tonight, just from the way of which he scored, via the post, via, attacking, via, obviously his step back threes, and, via operating in that mid range, it was probably like one of the more complete offensive performances I've seen from him. And it was a really good game. But, I think obviously, like we talked about in the intro, how he seemingly carried the Mavericks in this game. Why was that, Jaren? I want you to talk about the supporting cast as a whole. What specifically, we can definitely sort of iron out some different positives and, then nitpick guys accordingly, on an individual basis. But as a whole, where did the Mavericks fail tonight to, at one point in the third quarter, they were down by like 11 to this Detroit Pistons roster, who's now 13-39, seemingly dead in the water. Doesn't even, Kate Cunningham's been out all year. It's a very, very weak roster. Like, the average NBA fan probably doesn't know a lot of the guys that were playing in this game for the Pistons. So where did the Mavericks fail in terms of being able to apply pressure after a hot start, where they got up 10-0 early in that first quarter, and they just kept leaving the door open to the point on offense and defense that the Pistons looked like they were about to run away with the game in the third quarter?
Yeah, I mean, the Mavericks, it's pretty simple. Like, their DNA is let Luka either go to work and stand out the corner and wait for the ball to come to you, or, try and get some off-ball work. And that's something that the Mavericks just didn't really have the luxury of doing. It kind of seems like, especially these last few weeks, whenever we have seen Luka pretty much just turn into God mode, he's not going to pass. I think this was, and not to say he didn't pass, but this was another case of him just saying, all right, like, I have to put the team on my back once again, so let's go to work. we saw at times, guys were actually making shots, whether it was between Bullock, he got hot there. I know Josh Green hit a few. Like there was a number of guys that actually started getting things going. But in terms of just shooting, the Mavericks had a pretty bad shooting night. They shot 29% from three. And free throw line was awful. I think that's pretty much just said. But yeah, like I think the team just really couldn't find a way. Like, to Detroit's credit, they did a pretty good job of either allowing Luka, because that's how teams kind of have to work with the Mavericks, is either, all right, are we going to let Luka beat us, or are we going to let the surrounding cast beat us? At times Detroit would switch it, and they would let Luka pass the ball to a corner with Josh Green or Reggie Bullock, whoever it was, and that's kind of where Detroit started getting back in this game. But whenever they let Luka really go to work, it was whenever we saw the 24-point performance in the first half, or in the first quarter, and things like that. Like, the nature that the Mavericks really just couldn't score in was really only because of the surrounding cast. I mean, like I said, to Detroit's credit, they were pretty good at guarding other guys, whether it was inside or what. But yeah, I mean, whenever it comes to Luka, there was just no stopping him in this matchup, and that's really where the offense just bulked. Was just allowing Luka to go to work, spreading the floor, letting him have open lanes. Like, there was multiple times where he had like the mismatch, he would abuse it by just pretty much beating him off the first step, and then there would be the defender stepping up, and Luka would do, some may say this isn't athletic, but this is clearly athletic, where he would do like his super slow Euro step, and just pretty much step over the guy and then get a wide open layup. That's kind of what the really bulk of the offense was just stuff like that, where guys just spread the floor. But like I said, it was a bad shooting night. I think that's kind of where the Mavericks failed in terms of as a team effort. And yeah, I mean, just guys, we didn't really see any drives outside of really Luka's handful of drives that he had. Spencer had himself a few times, and then Dorian, of course, and as well as Josh, but that was pretty much about it as far as like offense goes.
Yeah, I think that the point that you were trying to make at the end there, that there was really like no offensive creation until that fourth quarter, when we saw Dinwiddie start to go to work a little bit in those non-Luka minutes. You could tell throughout stretches in this game that he was burnt out after those 235+ point performances in those games against Phoenix and the Jazz, respectively. And with the Mavericks seemingly having no other outside offensive creation, Christian Wood still being out, I think, was a huge part of that as well. They were just hard pressed to be able to generate anything in the half court. And we saw, you talked about Dorian and Josh driving a few times, but I mean, even in both of those instances, those are typically plays where, an off-ball screen is set, and then they end up getting a mismatch. And Luka ends up typically kind of curating those driving lanes for them by, setting them up in a favorable mismatch where they're able to just blow by a guy at the wing. It's not like they're, sizing a guy up into a mid-range jump shot. The only other guy on this roster that can do that is Spencer Dinwiddie outside of Luka. Yeah. So I'm like, we've been hammering for weeks on end now. I mean, it kind of just comes down to personnel in terms of the offensive failures in this game. Defensively, the Mavericks, I don't know if they did necessarily a terrible job, but at the same time, this Pistons team is very, very bad. And the fact that they just kept letting them have the door open, and they just kept letting them in, was definitely disheartening. Admittedly, in those final moments of the fourth quarter, those waning moments of the game, Bojan Bogdanovic was making some really, really tough shots with some good defense. And that's what kind of kept this from, being maybe a 10+ point win, a sizable margin of victory for the Mavericks to a clutch time victory. But even so, the Pistons shouldn't have led for large stretches in this game. Seemingly, because of the Mavericks, what some of the Mavericks defense was giving up to them. And, I also must preface that, I mean, some of the point of attack ball handlers for the Pistons were having just an absolutely atrocious shooting night. Like, Killian Hayes went 3 for 16 tonight. Sadiq Bey, he went 5 for 15. All of those threes, but he missed seemingly everything from, that mid-range area or in terms of getting into the paint. Jaden Ivey had a pretty good game, but he exited early with foul trouble, only played 21 minutes. This was a Detroit roster that, as depleted as they already are in terms of their roster personnel, was even more so depleted by having a couple guys have some pretty extreme off nights and some foul trouble. yet the Mavericks still conceded, really up until the fourth quarter. Detroit was playing a pretty affluent offense, to which the Mavericks didn't have much of an answer for. What do you think was the reason for the Mavericks' really bad defensive lapses in this game?
I mean, to me, I think it's pretty simple. I think Detroit did a really good job of attacking, whether it was Isaiah Stewart, he got some wide open shots inside, and even Duren. Guys, I just think it was a point of attacking. Like Jaden Ivey, he's such a good driver. And even though he's like only a rookie, like he's done a really good job of being able to free the offense up in just terms of driving. And that's really what we saw last night against the Mavs. At times, it just kind of looked like Detroit was, of course, they want to get to the foul line. I think that they're the first overall team whenever it comes to foul shooting. But they were relying on the Mavericks to foul. And that's really what I saw, was just a sense of not anything. I not a desperate team or anything like that. Detroit just did a really good job of like sticking with the Mavs, or at some point, I think they were up by 11 at one point, because of the foul line, because of the mid-range shots like that. And, in doing so, whenever you're driving, it's going to create open shots at the 3-point line. Now, they didn't have an amazing 3-point shooting night, but even still, they had enough enough drives, I guess, to open up and free up that 3-point line. And then from there, it's just simple kickouts, or, around the horn type scenarios. And that's sort of what we saw out of Detroit. And for the Mavericks, I mean, whenever Detroit is driving inside, like the Mavs don't really have anybody that can do anything. I mean, we saw JaVale McGee, of course, he got his 10 minutes checked in, where he honestly had a pretty efficient 10 minutes. It was a little lackluster on defense, and that's kind of where we saw him just sort of exit. And that's, like I said, just attacking the hoop and getting to the foul line. And the Mavs don't have a guy that can stop that. Dorian, he did as good of a job as he could. He honestly had a pretty good defensive night. And outside of that, I mean, there's, like I said, it was just hard pressed to get inside the paint and score that way, either getting to the foul line or kickouts. And for the Mavericks credit, or not to the Mavericks credit, but like to the Detroit's credit, is they did that outside of the fourth quarter, of course. But that's really defensively what I saw. And like I said, it wasn't an amazing defense. But outside of that, Detroit, I mean, they're the number one team in foul shooting for a reason. That's what they did. They got to the foul line 29 times or something like that.
Yeah, them and the Mavericks are actually number 1 and 2 in that category. And the rebounding battle actually ended up being tied from an offensive and defensive rebounds perspective by both teams. Both the Mavericks and the Pistons both respectively had 9 offensive rebounds and 31 defensive rebounds each in this game, which is kind of interesting. But it did seem as if through stretches in that first half that the Pistons were playing with a little bit more effort on the glass. And there were a lot of scenarios where Jalen Duren or Isaiah Stewart were kind of just outworking the Mavericks, especially a Mavericks team that throughout stretches in this game had to kind of concede and go small, something that we've seen them do fairly prevalently in these games without Christian Wood and Maxey ever since both of those guys have been out. The Mavericks are already undersized from a big man perspective, just in terms of, them not having some sort of premium 7-foot big men that can also switch, just the absolute prototype rim protector and switchable defender, albeit those guys are very limited. They're not just, waving their hands and asking to be, come picked up on the open market. But, the Mavericks are already sort of hard pressed in terms of their defensive versatility from a rim protection standpoint. And especially with Maxey and Wood out, we've seen this stretch amplify that even more so with some of these defensive lapses. And I think definitely kind of where it comes down to me at that standpoint is they just have no weak side help. Like if one guy gets beat at the point of attack, they're just absolutely screwed at that point, because once the big man, Dwight Powell, who is playing the 5 for a vast majority of these minutes in these games, right? Once he has to switch on to a smaller defender or something of that nature, they just don't have the size. They don't have like big enough wings to be able to counteract. When Detroit gets that penetration, is able to dump it off to a Durant or a Stewart, and they can kind of just go straight up. And I mean, both of those, I think Stewart even missed a few chippies in this game, but the Mavericks are conceding a lot of points to the dunker spots. And then when they start to clog the paint, that sometimes, we saw them a little bit last night try to do this where they played some zone, but we've seen it a lot more prevalently in some of these other games. And, once they try to, clog the paint a little bit more, bring more help and, try to trap more so from that free throw line area extended downwards, then, that ends up creating problems on the perimeter because, they end up getting beat so oft from that perspective. And, I do understand that both the issues of, point of attack defense and rim protection are, to a premium, but I do think that the rim protection from the Mavericks perspective could cover up some of these, lapses because when guys are getting beat at the point of attack or, when maybe the Mavericks had a rim protector, if he could recover to the dunker spot a little bit faster, but, with Dwight Powell out there as the lone big man, and then when the Mavericks are forced to go small, other teams just kind of abusing the inside, even if it does bode, better for their point of attack defense. Once Detroit is able to break it, they're seemingly screwed and they can get whatever they want at the rim when the Mavericks don't have a big man out there. It's just sort of a cumulative recipe for disaster. And especially without Maxey and Wood out there, they're hard pressed to be able to, have the personnel to be able to pull this off, right? Like they don't have, they're not the Clippers where they just have such an excess of 3-and-D wings that they're able to play small. And, those guys can hedge and recover so fast that on smaller big men, they can, they have so much size that it's okay. And they can survive those matchups when they get those mismatches and things of that nature. They can still guard up a little bit. They don't have that. They don't have like a Robert Williams with the Celtics last year, switchable five who can defend the rim. And, they're just, I feel like it just comes down to personnel. Like we can get schematic with it as much as they want, whether they're switching more, whether they're playing more zone. They've obviously been switching a lot more recently. I think as a sort of mechanism to try and, counteract getting beat as much, they may understand that that's going to lead to more mismatches, but it almost seems as if they're okay with that. They'd rather take a mismatch and take their chances than getting beat at the point of attack, because there was a stretch there where Reggie and Tim and Spencer were just getting blown by so much, right? So we have seen them switch a little bit more, but they're still having these defensive problems and they're still persisting even against really bad teams. And to say the least, it's obviously hard to see, but we hope that they can make a move around the trade deadline to mend this issue. But at the same time, as we mention every podcast, do they have the assets to facilitate such a thing? That remains to be seen. Jaren, now that we've kind of got past the sort of grim aspect of the defense and sort of all the inconsistencies that happen on that end in this game, let's talk about the role players a little bit individually, what went wrong and what went right in that aspect for them. Let's start with the bench for once, since we always do start with the starters. Jaden Hardy only played 6 minutes tonight, and he actually got a little bit of a crack at the rotation after, having not got too many bites at the apple recently. He's kind of fell out of the rotation a little bit. Frank Ntilikina kind of fell out completely. But, Hardy, this kind of looked like a game where, in a game where the Mavericks are still missing, some of that offensive creation with Christian Wood out, where he could really harness the opportunity to actually get some run in this game, especially against a worse Detroit team where the Mavericks could have really stepped on the pedal, put their foot in the pedal and got ahead. But there just wasn't the opportunity there for that. But, he only went 1 for 3 in 6 minutes, had a turnover. But, both of his field goal attempts got blocked. He had a very, he had an and one in that stretch that was really good where he started out. And then he kind of just fell off a cliff right there. And it almost seems as if Jason Kidd benched him. Could you maybe just speak to, some sort of, is there some sort of aspect there to where he's maybe hitting the rookie wall to an extent, or, and just kind of explain to some Mavs fans that want to see him, already thrust into that starter or 6-man position already, how he still has a ways to go before he, is obviously developmentally all there, but that's not to say that he is bad or, his game doesn't have a lot of potential, because we still think it does. What did you have to make of his performance tonight?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. To Jaden's credit, I think he's doing all the right things. He's going out there, he's having to prove a point. I think he's doing that. Now, is he doing that in a positive way? I don't think he's doing that necessarily. He's still going out there, and like I said, he's driving every chance he can get. He's taking every shot he can get. And as a rookie, I think that's the only thing that you can pretty much ask of them. You know, he doesn't have a huge role, like you said, like he's sort of kind of falling out of the rotation and everything. And look, I mean, that's just the inconsistencies of a rookie. That's what we're kind of running, or that's what we're going to run into. We kind of figured this at the start of the year. If we did see him, you know, we would probably see him at times just sort of not used. And that's kind of where I think he's hitting at right now. In terms of this game, he definitely hit. I think this was probably the highlight of his rookie wall moment or rookie block moment, however you want to call it. Because it seemed like anytime, you know, he was driving minus that and one, it kind of seemed like Detroit had his number. He got like blocked twice in a row, and then he got the ball stripped from him the second or the third time he tried to drive. I mean, like I said, like this is one where, you know, Detroit had it out for him. They made it a point to, you know, not let him drive at least, and they did. And they did a really good job at it. But yeah, I think if anybody's gonna be mad that he's fallen out of the rotation and they're blaming the coaching staff, whatever it is, like I don't think that's really the right place to put your blame on. And honestly, I don't think there's any place you can put your blame on. I mean, this is a guy that, again, he's 20 years old. He's gonna deal with his ups and downs, and this is for sure down. But yeah, I still think, and I still really like how confident he is. It kind of seems like whenever he gets blocked, he still, you know, gets up really quick and he's running down the other side. Like he's playing super aggressive still, and that's all that you can really ask for. You know, I feel like especially with these younger guys, they get so or they get so discouraged. You know, whenever they get blocked on the other end. But with this guy, he's, you know, bounces right back up and goes on the other end. And again, only 6 minutes of play tonight or last night. But still, I think, you know, it's just a rookie wall he's hitting. I'm not taking too much credence of it. Still, I think he's improving every minute he gets out on there.
Yeah, I just don't want people to overreact to this too much, right? Because just in terms of the style which this guy plays with, you know, we project him as a secondary ball handler and playmaker in the future. That's what he idealistically turns into, you know, a guy that's going to be able to create his own shot. And when he's going to have some inconsistencies in terms of making the wrong play or having an errant turnover or going up against two or three people when he shouldn't, you know, that comes down to a mental aspect. But at the end of the day, that's fixable. The intangibles with which this guy plays with, how savvy he is offensively, some of the moves he's able to make, his athleticism, those things, you know, those are a lot harder to try and mold into a guy versus fixing out just some of the mental intricacies of it. So I'm not all really too discouraged. I'm still here on the Hardy Party hype train. But we do need to recognize and, you know, be critical of the fact that he obviously had a pretty negative, you know, 6 minutes, even if it was just 6 minutes. Josh Green had a really good game last night. People were kind of on a rampage on him throughout the first 3 quarters of the game. You know, kind of saying, oh, you know, he still has a ways to go before he's back fully from injury. He's taking a hit to an extent, but I mean, I honestly think he's played pretty well in every single game he's played since coming back from that elbow sprain to an extent, barring, I think it was that game after the Heat game. He had a little of a rough performance. I can't remember specifically who that was against, but he's still, from an offensive perspective, still doing all the things that, you know, we had seen earlier pre-injury. You know, that was a 20-game stretch that he missed. And for the most part, I mean, he picked up where he left off right off the bat. He, you know, still isn't shooting a high volume of threes, but he's been pretty consistent with them still. He is still attacking off of closeouts or when somebody's dispositioned in terms of how they're guarding him at the end of the shot clock. He's still getting to the rim, getting a couple free throws every game, still running out in transition. We're not seeing the Mavericks use him in those 4-and-3 scenarios as much, but he is being really good as a ball mover. Anytime he gets the ball on the wing and he's forced to drive and the defense collapses and he doesn't have an open driving lane, he's doing a really good job with those dump off passes and just, you know, being savvy, being able to make the right read, whether that's getting to the guy rolling or, you know, segueing that pass to the corner for a three. He's been doing a really good job just in terms of all the things that we've been asking him to do. I thought it was yet another game where he played great defense last night too. He had multiple possessions as the on-ball defender, where he was just very nitpicky. He only had 2 fouls. He wasn't over fouling. He was, in guys' wheelhouse. He was, poking off their shins, stripping the ball out of bounds. He had a block. He had a steal in this game. Speak to his activity on the defensive side of things and how his offensive game continues to evolve, and just how he's been able to hold up after returning from that elbow sprain through his first few games back so far.
Yeah, I think my only harp on the guy is, and this is me being totally greedy, is I just want to see him shoot more. He's so uber efficient. He always has those 3-for-4 stat lines. Like, he never really shoots over like 7 shots in a game. And he's always super efficient in doing so. But yeah, like I said, me being greedy, I just want to see him do more on the offensive end, just take more shots, be more assertive. And that's just not who he is right now. He's a guy that, he works through the flow of the offense. Whatever you need him to do, he's going to go and do. Defensively, I mean, he was everywhere. There was multiple times where he just sort of, I don't know, he's just so aggressive on ball defending and even off ball defending. Sometimes he'll go off his man, whether like if someone's standing in a corner, whoever he's guarding, he'll recognize the mismatch, whether it's Tim Hardaway on someone or whatever it may be. Like, he'll go and recognize that and then just go and either show a double, or he'll actually go full force and just straight up double. And at times we've seen it kind of hurt the Mavericks, but we like to see that because that's actually aggressive. I know before he got hurt, he was doing really good on just sort of collapsing as a defender. Whenever the big gets inside the paint, he would do a really good job of doubling and forcing the ball out of his hands. And that's kind of what we saw tonight, or last night, sorry, where like Jalen Duren would get the ball inside, or Isaiah Stewart, whoever it was, and he would just do a really good job of collapsing. I mean, he's a really good, just defensive minded guy, whether it's help side or on ball. Like, there's really not a hole in this guy's defensively. There's not a hole in his wheelhouse. Like, he's just really good defender. He's a really good defender. But I think, defensively, he was just pretty much everywhere. He was really aggressive. Even on the offensive end, he was really assertive, driving, dumping off to the dunker spot. Whoever it was, Dorian or, Dwight Powell, whoever it was, he was doing a really good job of that. And like I said, me being greedy, I just want to see him shoot more, just because I know how efficient he is. He's shooting like 43% from 3, like some crazy stat line like that. But this is another showing of how efficient he is on offense and how effective he is on defense.
Yeah, no, 100%. He had the highest plus minus time for the Mavericks with a plus 17. And I think his defensive game will continue to evolve even more so as he's able to just get a little bit more smarter, because he's already so savvy at rotating and making the right reads on that end. But once he's able to eliminate the over fouling and takes less gambles, that's when we're going to see this guy evolve into, potentially a top 20 defender in the league. I earnestly believe he can reach that pedigree at some point in his career. JaVale, like you alluded to earlier, came in because Dwight Powell picked up 3 early fouls, and he actually was serviceable to an extent in that second quarter and that early third quarter portion. Did a really good job on offense. He was doing his little post hook stuff where he was able to get it over the top of some guys. Was staying in the right position. He still had a few errant JaVale moments where he was very late to rotate on defense or, jump as the weak side help, rim protector. And there was one time where he was throwing the ball in out of bounds, and or maybe it was off of a missed, and he got a missed shot, and he got a rebound, and he threw it to the wrong guy in transition. It was like an easy Pistons basket right away. So there were still some JaVale moments, but I thought he did a decent job coming in and being serviceable on offense. That's all you can ask from him at this point. We already know that, his contract and the way he's played this year has sort of turned out to be this abomination, and we don't really know what his future with this team is. But I was happy to see that he at least came in and provided a solid 8 points, in some minutes where the Mavericks needed just the presence of a big man out there, because they can play small throughout stretches. But when they, were really just hammering Duran and Stewart out there, the Mavericks needed to fill in the gaps in those minutes. And JaVale provided a fail safe there once Dwight Powell got in some foul trouble. Reggie Bullock, I thought, had a decent night. He still was having sort of a rough time in terms of, having to guard Jaden Ivey, who he was tasked having to defend a lot of times in this game. he conceded the mid-range jumper to him and let him kind of shoot over the top of him. It almost like looked scared as if he was able to get blown by. So there were some inconsistencies there, but he shot the ball well, and he continues his very hot shooting after a very slow start to the season, as we see him sort of flip the script every year. Had 9 points on 3 of 5 shooting from 3. Davis Bertans kind of played 8 minutes and nothingness off the bench, as he typically does. But that was, really it for the bench. They not a ton of help, but I don't really have a whole lot of gripes from how they played tonight.
Yeah, in terms of Bertans, this is a guy where we've seen him have these games where he's either going off and has 9 points on 3 of 3 shooting, or pretty much just does nothing out there. And this was another case of doing nothing. You literally see throughout the stat line, the only stat he produced was 0 for 3 from the field, and then 1 personal foul and 8 minutes of play. That's really the only thing that he can't offer if he's not making threes. So I guess in terms of the bench, that's pretty much the rundown. Honestly, I think in terms of in terms of how the bench is producing, this is probably one of the better games, because we got CJ Vail get some positive minutes. Josh Green, Hardy, he got his fair share of minutes where he was not effective and then effective in one of those minutes. In terms of Reggie and Bertans, Reggie did a really good job. But as far as the bench goes, I think that pretty much just covers it.
Yeah, no, it was a very they definitely met par, but it was a very average game from the bench. There was no guy who really stood above the rest. Josh Green played really good from, all areas, and, he had a great all-around game, but he didn't, stand alone in a category of excellence, beside those other guys, to your point. In terms of Spencer, he went 5 of 16 from shooting, really only caught wind and or caught fire, rather, I guess, if you want to denote, give him that much credit. In that fourth quarter, at the beginning stage of the fourth quarter, in those non-Luka minutes, where we actually finally saw his shot start to drop a little bit. When he was playing with Luka in this game, he just wasn't assertive at all. We saw him kind of divert back to just being a guy that just kind of stands on the corner and runs in transitions, more complimentary. But right before Luka sprained his ankle, Spencer, I thought, was doing a much better job playing with Luka, still fitting a need there. He obviously definitely looked winded, was missing some chippies and, some threes he normally knocks down, went 0 for 6 from 3 on the night. He was having a rough go at it offensively. He has his typical sort of wishy-washy defense in this game. Do we give him an excuse because of the burden that he had to carry offensively the last 2 games, something that he's not necessarily accustomed to with those 35-plus point performances? Or do we write this off as a very poor game for him, one of which he wasn't able to provide any sort of competent offensive basketball in really until the beginning stages of that fourth quarter?
Me personally, I'm going to give him the pass. And this is just because the fashion at which he did carry the team. 2 35-plus point performances in a row, and just kind of having to do the minutes that he did in those 2 games. Now, one thing I do think, how Luka does this on a night in, night out basis and he has been for 3 months or 4 months, however long the season has been. And then the Spencer does it for 2 games, and it's kind of oh, let's give him a break. But needless to say, his sort of jump hooks that we usually see, his layups that we are accustomed to see him making, just weren't falling. And I know you mentioned some of the 3-pointers that he hacks up usually go in. We didn't see a single one last night. But yeah, he definitely started to pick things up in that fourth quarter. Things started to fall. And I think in large part to why Spencer was so effective in that 2-game stretch was basically because, and I said this on the podcast, I think Luka was off the floor. And Spencer, we know this, he's more effective when Luka is off the floor, and that's why he's so he's a good 2-guard. Is because he is effective whenever he's off the floor. But I think that in large part was why he was, super honestly talented, and not talented, but was really good in those 2-game stretches. And we just didn't really get to see him perform at the level that we were accustomed to seeing over that 2-game stretch. Now, needless to say, like I said, I'm going to give him the pass on this one because, again, shots just really weren't falling, and he did look tired at times. In that fourth quarter, it was a complete script turnaround. He looked a lot better in those non-Luka minutes. He was actually, finishing shots. I think he had 10 points in the fourth quarter. He looked a lot different. But in terms of me, I'm going to give him the pass. I don't know how you feel about it.
No, I would definitely concur with you, but I do want to pose a question to you regarding him. Even if you want to make the argument that Spencer himself is better in the non-Luka minutes, which I think I would tend to agree with. Are the Mavericks better as a team when Spencer is playing assertive, when he's playing with Luka, when they're together? Like when you're getting not peak Dinwiddie, but I guess when Spencer is actually playing assertive, he's not just relegated to this guy who's standing in the corner in those minutes that he is with Luka. Do you think that they're better than just the solo Luka minutes or solo Dinwiddie minutes?
Yeah, I think the Mavericks offense is a lot better whenever he's effective and actually running the floor a little bit whenever Luka's on the floor. I think that's whenever the offense looks more fun. Like this was a game, like I hate to say it, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Luka's 53-point performance, but this was a game that was honestly kind of hard to watch at times, just because nothing was really happening outside of Luka. And at least there's something else happening whenever Spencer's doing it. It sort of frees up the floor a little bit too, whenever it's him and Luka going to work. And I know, like as you mentioned before, Luka had his little ankle sprain. They were really bouncing off each other really well. Spencer was actually being assertive over that like 2-week stretch or whatever. And this was a game where it just completely erased what he did. And again, I think that's because he was tired, whatever. But yeah, I think, it just frees up so much more opportunity on offense for the guy, not even for those two to go to work, but for the whole team to go to work. We just kind of see, I don't want to say the cap, but we see the full potential of that Mavericks team whenever they're both bouncing off each other, as they did in that 2-week stretch before Luka unfortunately sprained his ankle.
I would agree with you 100%. I mean, just the ability of two guys to be able to play make and furbish their own shot and get to the rim opens up so much more things for you offensively than just having one guy that can do that, of course. And that's why even in a game where Luka scores 53, we don't see, it was a good offensive game from the Mavericks last night, but it's against a very lackluster and very inexperienced Pistons team. And by no means was it a great offensive game. And there's still, we still haven't seen that, distinguished explosion from them on offense, unless they just completely go away from, playing any sort of defensive guys in their rotation. They could have the highest offensive rating if they wanted to in the league, but they would give up about 1 million points as well. So that's obviously not something we want to see. So I would definitely tend to agree with you on that standpoint. I thought that was an interesting point of discussion to bring up. What did you think of how Tim Hardaway Jr. shot the ball tonight? He had sort of a rough go at it. I think it was your typical, bad defense, off shooting night from Tim. I don't really know how much more I can sum it up.
Yeah.
It's every once in a while he plays capable defense. I wouldn't say good, but he plays average defense, takes a few charges. Tonight was one of those games where he kind of, just looked lost on both sides of the ball and his shot wasn't falling and everything else kind of, went in sync with that. What did you have any other thoughts on him in terms of his game tonight?
Yeah, I mean, like honestly, everything you said, I think pretty much sums it up. Like the only positive I can really take away from Tim defensively is he does a good job of cutting off the lane. And in doing so, I know last night he did it and he unfortunately got called for a foul, but he has times where he's like able to draw multiple fouls in a game or multiple charges in a game, I should say. And that's sort of like the only super positive aspect of Tim's game is I want to say he's like 3rd or 4th all time in the NBA, not all time, but this season in charges drawn. But needless to say, this was another game where Tim was just really ineffective on offense, ineffective on defense, would hack up shots. He went 3 of 10 from the field in this matchup. He would hack up shots and it just kind of looked, like it was never going in from the start. And we've seen this from Tim over the last few weeks. It just kind of seems like his, sort of 27-point performances are kind of done. And I don't want to take anything away because this is just, I think is like a little tiny slump from him because it seems like it's been a handful of games. But yeah, I'd like to see him, bounce back against the Pelicans a little bit. But needless to say, this is one of his rougher matchups defensively and offensively. Like I said, only went 3 for 10 from the field and defensively just wasn't really able to do anything from the start. Like I didn't, this is a bad game from him overall.
Yeah. Lastly, kind of finishing with some of these other dudes, like I thought Dwight Powell, he had some good hustle minutes. He had 6 offensive rebounds, was getting a lot of tip outs in this game, was doing what he could. I thought Duran did a really good job mirroring him on those pick and roll scenarios and staying home. Dwight Powell only had 4 points in this game. Just because he really didn't have a lot of opportunities. He missed a few chippies off some offensive rebounds, had a few like putbacks that he didn't convert. But outside of that, I mean, typical Dwight Powell game, spotty defense, the pick and rolls hit or miss depending on the coverage that the other team's playing.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much a summation of it. He
yeah.
honestly like he sat pretty well in the dunker spot at times.
No, yeah.
Josh was able to find him. Luke was able to find him, but outside of
Yeah.
that, I don't think he was super effective on offense.
Yeah, I would agree. It just real his offensive production is very, codependent on how the other team kind of guards the Mavericks. So, he fared okay. Lastly, Dorian. He had 35 minutes in this one, only went 2 for 5 from the field. Ever since he's come back from injury, I feel like he has not really tapped into that assertiveness that we've seen from him in the past in terms of his offense. There's been spurts of it that we didn't even really see early on in the season where he's like attacked off a closeout a few times and got to the rim for some layups and like, oh wow, this is the whole Dorian, or got an offensive rebound, a putback jam. But a lot of the time, we're just seeing him pass up on a lot more looks. He only shot 1 3 tonight. He's still doing a pretty good as a defender. I thought he honestly did a very good job despite the stat line that he had defending Bojan Bogdanovic. Bogdanovic was making some really, really tough shots tonight, but I thought Dorian mirrored him pretty well. But offensively, he's still kind of working to get his mojo back. Could you speak to maybe some of the things that Dorian has yet to fully harness coming off that hip abductor strain?
Yeah, I think one of the things Dorian kind of elevated in his game last year was just able to sort of like drive off a closeout. That's a skill that we haven't really seen him work on too much this year. And like I said, like that was one where he really elevated last year. Unfortunately though, like we've seen it at times where he's able to, off the closeout drive and either get an easy layup or a contested layup. But this was sort of one where we just didn't even see him be super effective. He's a really good, like around the arc kind of mover. Like he always finds the open pockets and Luka either gets it to him at the top of the key or in the corner, whatever it is. But I just don't think, in this matchup, I think he had too much on his plate, not too much on his plate, but I think defensively he was just looked at so much that on offense, it was sort of his rest period. And I'm not trying to take anything away from him or anything, because he still had a pretty good night, like effective night. I think he went 2 for 5 from shooting. Yeah, he did. So not super inefficient, but not like assertive or anything. But I just think, in terms of him, he just needs to be more assertive, whether it's, essentially creating his own offense off of closeouts or whatever it may be. But yeah, he defensively, like I think he held Bojan into check pretty much 3 out of the 4 quarters. I think like heading into the 4th quarter, Bojan had like 17 points, which his average is like 24 on the year, 21, something like that. So I think he did as good of a job as he could. And even whenever Bojan did start to go off, it was tough defense. Like every shot that Bojan made was like essentially hand right in his face. And that's just Bojan being Bojan, like just hailing up a shot and getting it to go. And I mean, he made it look easy, but that's NBA talent right there. But yeah, I think, offensively, that was sort of the struggles that we dealt with. And then defensively, I think he had a pretty good matchup, or a pretty good game, I should say. Like you said, on Bojan, I know he had to be switched on to Sadiq Bey at times and even guarded up Sadiq pretty well. But outside of that, I think he just had a really, really efficient night defensively. And then offensively, he just, it was one of those, early season type games where he's just not really there, but still finishes with a semi-decent shooting night.
Yeah, no, I would definitely concur. And from the Pistons side of things, I mean, they didn't really do anything out of the ordinary that I think necessarily shell shocked the Mavericks. I think the Mavericks, just played down to them a lot of the time. And then when they finally were starting to pull away, Bogdanovic was making some really tough shots. But I mean, even, more so like I alluded to in the intro, like if anything, the Pistons had, a bit of a, they bared some negative regressions from some guys who are, pretty bad, admittedly, as far as NBA goes. But maybe aren't this bad. Like, I mean, Killian Hayes, I know there's a lot of discourse on how, sort of bust potential, how much sort of bust potential he has and things of that nature. But I mean, he played like absolutely terrible and the Mavericks were giving him whatever he wanted and he just clanked everything in existence. It was really as simple as that. 2 for 10 from the 3-point line, 3 for 16 from the field. I thought both of their bigs and Durant and Stewart played their role well. Kevin Knox, he exists still. he I don't know, man. He's still, he's not, I guess, the dynamic scoring threat that anybody thought he was going to be in New York, but he's a serviceable little rotation player. I was interested to kind of see him. He had a few turnovers, but I thought he did a good job getting into the lane a couple times. Isaiah Livers, I know him and Luka were chirping back each other at the end, but Luka asked him who he was because nobody knows his name, supposedly. But and admittedly, I honestly didn't know too much about him for this game. I vaguely remember him from that first Pistons game, but he knocked in a few threes. He's an intriguing guy. He's not too terrible. And they're veterans. Alec Burks played decent. And, we talked about Sadiq Bey and all that. So, I mean, the Mavericks just simply played down to their opponent. That they just didn't have it from their supporting cast tonight. And from, it wasn't even as much, I think, that it was just some sort of asinine effort from all parties involved tonight, where they just weren't contributing anything whatsoever. It was more so the cumulative contribution that the Mavericks role players were giving them tonight was just not enough. Like, nobody was aggressive enough. Nobody was really providing anything outside of Luka. Like, they were basically having Luka force the issue almost every single possession. Like, I think his points created tonight was, I believe, like over 70. And on top of that, because he had 8 assists, I mean, he had 5 assists, so it might have been like 65, something like that. But I mean, he was just looked to as the absolute bulk of all offensive production. And even if he wasn't necessarily the, direct catalyst of an assist or a made basket, he was still basically, when he was on the floor in his 36 minutes, generating basically everything, and setting up every single play and setting up and curating, open looks for the Mavericks, even if he had to operate out of a double team or what have you. I mean, he was doing all the heavy lifting in this game. So before we end the podcast, I just wanted you to kind of speak to this upcoming trade deadline, not necessarily maybe eyeballing like the Mavericks needs, you don't need to go that in depth, but has this reached a point to where, it is dire enough to say that the Mavericks really just don't, even if Christian Wood was playing this game, even if Maxi's there, they have, collectively failed over these last few years to adequately surround Luka Doncic with the proper talent, or do you still think that, this is still part of a plan to where they're going to be able to bring this thing back into full force? Or I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on their standing from that aspect.
I think, yeah, like honestly, I don't really know. I mean, the Mavericks, they can go down 2 different routes, and each route is going to be extremely different in the outlook of the team in the future. Like, the Mavericks can either hold still, make a few, minor trades that they think is going to work in the future, or, they not go all in, but they can, pick a Bojan in the team, a guy where you're going to have to trade a first round pick for, but ultimately he's going to make you better this season. I know Bojan's a guy who's a little bit older and everything like that. So that's sort of like the dilemma that this team is having to face, is balancing future on top of now. And right. I mean, you have a win now guy in Luka. So it's kind of like, how do you keep him happy? But also, how do you prepare for the future? And honestly, I don't really, of course I don't have the answers. I'm not credentialed enough to even, talk to anybody or anything like that. But just sort of, the hearings around the word, like, do the Mavericks go not all in this offseason, but I mean, do they pick a guy like a Bojan, not necessarily a guy who's going to push you up on the championship sort of echelon, but a guy who sort of moves the needle? Or do you take a guy like Cam Reddish, someone who, has future benefits, assuming they work out? But again, it's going to take some time to, sort of create his mold on this team. And again, like I said, like, I don't really know. I personally think this season's kind of long gone. I think the season, at this point, especially with this stretch of, how many games they've lost, I think you pretty much boot this season, try and make the playoffs. If you make the play-in tournament, cool, try and make the playoffs again. But I think this is one where you pretty much put up the white flag in terms of going after, or not going after, but put up the white flags in terms of, pushing your team into that second round or even Western Conference Finals-esque type roster. And getting that second guy on your roster. I think you put up the white flag for that scenario. And I think, me personally, I would prepare for the future. I think next year the Mavericks have some money in cap that they can work around, and hopefully they do the right moves that sort of, I guess, weaponize them for a next year run. But I think that, pretty much this season, I think you just have to move on, get the guys that you need for next season. And that's how I would look at this offseason, or look at this trade season, my bad.
Yeah, I mean, they are pretty hard pressed in terms of their cap space situation till about 2025. So any leniency that they make here in terms of improving the roster is going to be via trade, whether it's this offseason or at the deadline. And we'll divulge more heavily into it in terms of our opinions regarding what exactly we think the direction of this team should be, whether, it's taking a step back to take a step forward and getting a little bit younger, or if they really should go all in at this trade deadline, right? That's something that we'll divulge into more when we get into our trade deadline podcast that we have upcoming tomorrow. And then we'll do one more before the deadline, of course. But at the same time, it's a very hard balancing act. And I do think, though, that, I've sort of avoided the discourse regarding this. We obviously allude to Luka getting more help and things of that nature. But I do think it's at a point now where Luka, the national spotlight on it is, has obviously expedited quite a bit since the beginning of the season, just in terms of him needing help. And I don't know, I do think it's reached a point to where he may start to get disgruntled. I mean, yeah, he's a happy-go-lucky guy, but I mean, he's playing with a lot of fire and passion. I mean, you see what this guy pours in on a night in, night out basis. We saw him getting fiery with the Pistons coach tonight, after the game, saying when he was the Pistons coach, which was contesting him, the assistant coach it was, and I forget the guy's name in that first quarter. He was, they were obviously batting heads. And then, I'm sure you've seen it on ESPN or wherever, but his interview with Skin Wade, where Luka was like, hey, like, he was talking trash. I'm just going to come here and play ball, like, and proceeds to go score 53. I mean, like, this is legendary stuff that we're seeing out of this guy to an extent. I don't care how old he is or, if he still has yet to reach his prime. I mean, you have to be able to harness the potential of this team with him as the spearhead and him as the leader. And I just believe that they're simply not doing that right now. And I know that it's a challenge. I know that he may have been too good, too fast for them to accumulate the necessary draft assets or free agent signings and things of that nature. But, whether we want to go to Donnie Nelson or Nico Harrison's terms on this team, they may not just be complete objective failures, but at the very least, they've been subpar. And there's a lot of things that we can micro critique and tell them that they could have improved upon. And that's discarding whatever, Cuban is doing behind the scenes, whatever input he has and whatever he is micromanaging behind the scenes and however much he controls things like that. That's really just from, the trade aspect and things of that nature. So, we could talk about it all day, and we will on our trade podcast coming up. But this game, I think, out of any game this season, was the biggest far cry to get Luka Doncic help.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. Yeah. This is one where everybody but Luka looked helpless at times. So
yeah. No, and we will be back tomorrow with our trade deadline podcast. We finally have 2 days in between games, so we are hyped to do this. Should be back with the full gang. Rodrigo should be joining us again, but if he doesn't, me and Jaren will be here, and we'll be doing the podcast for you guys. Just happy that the Mavericks are still treading water. They still kind of have yet to pick a direction this season, but if they don't pick a direction soon, we'll see what happens at the trade deadline. That's going to constitute what direction they pick in.
Yeah.
If they don't pick a direction soon, then they're going to be in this sort of stage of mediocrity this season. They're going to be around this 500 marker probably for the rest of the year, and they're going to be in that play-in echelon like we've been alluding to on this podcast, or, maybe slightly above that. So we'll kind of see how things go. But for right now, that's just sort of the state of the team. That's, they get an injury or two. This is just sort of the ceiling of this team, is to be in that play-in, 500 echelon. So if they can, a win is a win at the end of the day. Like we always say, this isn't a team that has, we all, we can nitpick everything we want, but at the end of the day, this roster doesn't really give us the luxury to be able to, micro critique wins at the end of the day. We have to enjoy it to an extent, right? Because next game could be a really bad loss, but we're 27-25 right now. There is between the Western Conference standings, between 4 and 13 at the moment, there is only 4 games of parity. So, I mean, it's not completely ridiculous to say the Mavericks could be out of the playoffs completely this year. Like, who knows what's going to happen? But we just need to keep treading water, because if we're going to be in this mediocre state, let's at least get some wins, right? Let's have some fun with it, right? Because that's just sort of the state of the union right now. I'll save my whole State of the Union Abraham Lincoln address for the next podcast, when I really
that'll be our pre-trade podcast.
Yeah,
State of the podcast.
The State of the Team podcast always transcend the post-game podcast, because I get much more passionate and fiery. I hold back everything right now, but we will be getting into all that and divulging into all that for you guys on Wednesday night. And
tomorrow night.
We honestly, I think we'll probably post it. If we have time, we may record midday Wednesday. As ice storm in Dallas, it's sort of relegating all of our other endeavors to the side right now. So we will get that out early if we can, but if not, it'll come out the latest Wednesday night before midnight, hopefully. The absolute worst, you guys, it'll be in your podcast inboxes sometime early on Thursday morning. And then the Mavericks play Thursday, and we will have a post-game podcast for that, of course, as well. Thank you guys for listening. If you got this far in the pod, if you're listening on YouTube, or watching on YouTube rather, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. Comment who you would like to see the Mavericks go get at the NBA trade deadline, this trade deadline. If the trade deadline is February 9th, who is your number one target for the Mavericks? If you guys are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoy our stuff. We really appreciate you guys. And I feel like I'm missing one other thing right now.
Chris Silva.
What? Oh, Chris Silva. Yeah. Well, no. Okay. So before we end this podcast, sorry for prolonging and premeditating that outro, but the Mavericks signed Chris Silva to a 10-day contract today, a sort of switchable wing. He's 26, coming out of the College Park Skyhawks, another South Carolina Gamecock, just like AJ Lawson. He is a guy that he's sort of a, very versatile defender, can kind of guard 1 through 5 to an extent. He's, big, long, good rebounder. Difficulties in terms of his NBA career have really came at the offensive end. He just really hasn't carved out a role on that side of things. It's kind of been just a guy that operates in the short role, not really a guy who's found his shot whatsoever. Very much like a Rondé Hollis Jefferson type guy in terms of the comp that I would give him. But the Mavericks signed him to a 10-day contract this morning with their open roster spot that was vacant after the Kemba Walker waiving. So I'm excited for that. Let's see if he actually cracks the rotation any sort of manner. I don't know if he will, but he's on a 10-day contract. It gives the Mavericks a little more flexibility to do a 2-for-1 trade and things of that nature. Maybe the Mavericks are trying to stack on some wing depth for a trade. Maybe Dorian's late. I don't know. But there's a lot of rumors and stuff that we will be divulging into our trade podcast. We know a lot's came out over the last few days. We're not negligent towards it. We're not just blind to everything that's coming out. There's a reason that we're saving it for the trade deadline podcast. We're not talking about it in the post-game podcast. But with that being said, we really appreciate you guys for listening this far in the podcast. And, if you don't have anything else, Jaren, we will catch you guys after, or no, not after the post game, tomorrow night.
Yeah, tomorrow night. Yeah.
All right.
Bye-bye.